Welcome back to Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. We've laid a foundation, we've talked about our purpose and approach, and we've learned a lot about the seeds of liberty that came from our founding fathers and actually from 100 years before to give us that foundation. Now let's actually jump into the Constitution, but let's do it from a little bit of a distance first to see the big picture.
Well, as you said about this lesson, this is the 30,000-foot view, and that is really important. And I was thinking about that from the aspect of, with all the documents we have here, I recently had opportunity to acquire some of the battle maps used by three-star generals who ran the Allied forces in World War II over Italy.
So and by the way, that's a great point in terms of your library. It's not just books in here.
That's right.
You've got all these proclamations we talked about in the last chapter, but even maps, battle maps.
Even battle maps. And so in looking at that, I was struck with the fact that this three-star general is looking at all of Italy. Now, you got a lot of battles going. You got Anzio, and you got all these other battles in Italy, but he's looking at the overview of it. And if you're in that battle in Anzio, that's the most important thing in the world to you.
And that's all you see.
That's all
what
you
you're
see.
Focused on.
That's what you're focused on. But sometimes you need to be at that three-star general or patent four-star general and back up and say, wait a minute, I'm looking at all of North Africa here, and I've got about 20 battles going on, and I've got about these many divisions and these many, and I've got to move them all. And so thinking at that level is what we're going to do this. And I thought a good way to do that is to actually look at an old battle map plan. Just to show a good example of this, let's go back in history for a bit to American history. And you have really the French and Indian War. George Washington is a 23-year-old colonel here. And this is a battle in a time that shaped his life militarily. The only official defeat he ever had in his entire military career was right here in this battle.
Now, is this, by the way, the Bulletproof George
Bulletproof
Washington?
George
You've got
Washington.
a book on that.
We got a book on that.
Audio, actually.
Dean Jones, the audio book.
So this is where that happened?
This is where it happened. And the only defeat he suffered was on the 4th of July of 1754. The only official defeat he ever suffered. Wow. So this shaped a lot, but when you look here, I mean, it all happens right in here, and that's significant. And there's several things that are very important. Alexandria here, where all the ships in the British land, and then they march, and Washington actually takes his guys up in here to a place called Fort Necessity in Great Meadows. Then they have this massive battle over here at Fort Duquesne, but it was all being done out of Presque Isle up here at Lake Erie. And then after the battle, they have to go back to right here, Fort Cumberland. And so there's 5 big areas here, but if you're a general like Edward Braddock, or if you're an officer like Washington, you see all of those things.
You'd want to see all of that at once.
You want to see it, but what happened was, this is the battle map of what happened when they got to Fort Duquesne. Now, the troops here, the British and American troops, are strung out over 4 miles. Over 4 miles long is this battle that they're in. So they're scattered out, the French and Indians, and the Indians all around here, and here's the Americans and the British here. And so what happens is, if you're this guy right back here, the most important thing in the world to you is what's happening right there. Yeah, but you got to see the overall thing. Here's where the real threat, yeah, you're getting shot at back here, but we got to deal with these guys up here. But you know, it's not just these guys there. We've got to deal with what's coming out of press. And so you start getting back and you start saying, you know, it's easy to get focused on where I am and miss the big picture of this. Yeah. And so that's why battle maps help you understand the big picture. And really, the battle map for what we're going to do is the Constitution. And so we want to understand the Constitution, as you say, a 30,000-foot view. So let me just give a real simple view of the Constitution. The 3 big articles are Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Article 1 defines and tells Congress what it can do. Article 2 defines and tells the President what he can do. Article 3 defines and tells the courts what they can do. Real simple. Notice how this works. Article 1 is 2,268 words. It's 111 lines in the Constitution telling Congress, here's what you can do. Nothing else, this stuff right here. Article 2 is the President. It's less than half and 1,025 words and 48 lines. So he gets to do a whole lot. The Constitution only lets him do so much, and it's a whole lot less than Congress. And then you look at judiciary, my gosh, the total scope of what the judiciary is allowed to do is 377 words, only 18 lines in the Constitution. Now, if I look at that...
It's a small percentage of...
Oh, tiny.
Of the Congress, but that's the battle map then.
That's the battle map.
If you're looking at the whole thing at once, so where's your most important...
When somebody tells me that the 3 branches are equal, I'm going to look at that and say, wait a minute.
Hardly.
Not hardly.
Yeah.
It looks to me like all the weight is up in Congress, and there ain't no weight down here.
But if you're
zoomed in, forgive me for speaking Texan there.
Yeah, that's okay. We want a lot of Texan in this. If you're zoomed in here on just the courts, and you're reading what the court says, and
then
they
you
say there's
forget
three equal
the
branches.
perspective.
Yeah,
See,
you don't have the perspective to compare.
And this is where this book is so, this is the Federalist Papers. So this was done after they had written the Constitution, but before they ratify. This is trying to convince everybody in America, you need, particularly in New York, that you need to ratify the Constitution. So done by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and so they're saying, here's why you ratify. And in here, it says exactly what we see on the battle map. It says in here, and I can read them, I've got them marked, but in the Federalist Papers it tells us that the legislative authority necessarily predominates. They're saying it's stronger than the other branches, yeah. And when you get over here,
maybe they're saying necessarily because they are looking at the big picture.
They are.
You know, if they were only looking at the legislature, they're not comparing it to the other battles that are taking place. If we stick with our battle map,
Article 1, you can get at those people every 2 years.
Yeah.
Article 2, you can get at that person every 4 years. Article 3, it's a little harder to get those people, so we make sure they can't do much because we can't get at them as often. And we get at him every 4 years, so we'll make sure he doesn't have as much. But the guys we can get at every 2 years,
these guys necessarily predominate.
They predominate because we can get to them, and we can get to them regular.
Yeah.
And so that's why all the power is vested in Congress, not in the courts and not in the president. And that's why this also tells us, it says the judicial branch is by far, by comparison, the weakest of the three branches.
That is by far when you look,
that is
look
by
at those
far.
two. Or even there, it's almost 4 times.
And they even tell you, judiciary is so weak. It says the liberty of the people can never be endangered from that branch. Really?
Wow.
I don't think we've read the battle plan in a while. I don't think we've gone back. And so that's why looking, and that's why what you're going to do with this 30,000-foot view is so significant, because you need to see how all the battle plan. If you're over here fighting the judges, you think that's the most important part of the Constitution. But if you get the overall view, if you're the general director in this, you say, you know, Article 4 is really important too, the Republicanism Clause. Article 5 is really important on amending the Constitution. Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, really important stuff. And we don't think about that because we're in battles on other places.
Well, you wouldn't even know how to win that particular battle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're totally focused in on just the judiciary and you don't step back and see the full battle plan, you don't see the tools that these other branches have to rein them in. You don't see the tools that we have in Article 5 to amend. I mean, if you just focus on the one battle, you're going to lose the war.
Yeah, you've got the general saying, well, I'm getting attacked over here, but I got a whole division I can bring down here. And you're right, exactly. You have to know the other tools that are there that you can call in to be a resource. But if you're fixed to that one battle, you know, if you're right there in the Battle of Monongahela with George Washington, you don't know about Fort Cumberland, you don't know about Presque Isle, you don't know about Alexandria, but that's why we look at this from 30,000 foot
and we will dive into each of those areas.
Right.
So first we're going to get that big picture view. We'll dive in later, but let's head back to Independence Hall for a 30,000 feet view of the entire Constitution. Well, welcome back to Constitution Alive. We're finally ready to dive into the actual Constitution. First, we're going to step back and look at it from what I call a 30,000 feet view. I don't know about you guys, but I have a hard time just opening page 1. As a kid, I always went to the back of the book, you know, to see what was happening at the end. So I like to look at the whole thing. I want to look at the cover. I want to see the big picture first, and then I'm ready to dive into those specific areas. So for the next few minutes, we're going to literally fly through the entire Constitution and get a big picture of those 7 articles and those 27 amendments. So we kind of know where the pieces are, and then we'll zero in. Most of our time will be on Article 1, Section 8, because we're going to talk about the enumerated powers of Congress, what Congress can actually do, or what Congress is supposed to be doing. So first we're going to step back, though, and look at the whole thing. And, of course, you can't look at the whole thing without starting with that preamble. So I'm going to ask my daughter, Cameron, to come forward and join us. She's been wanting to get across that rail into this sacred room. Y'all welcome Cameron. Cameron Green's going to come join us. Come on up, baby. Right there. All right, share those first words that Gouverneur Morris wrote for us.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Great job, baby. Way to go. All right. Good job. Okay. If I was a smarter man, I'd have her teach the rest of the class. We'd be a lot better off. So, there you have the preamble. Morris wrote this one entirely himself. Now, the preamble, of course, doesn't have the force of law. So, I kind of think of it in terms of like a business letter where you got your RE colon, this is what the letter's about. And then you get into the meat of the letter. That's the way I think of the preamble. It sort of sets the stage for us of here's what the Constitution is going to be all about. I do want to point out, though, and that's why we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to point out 2 very quick things out of the preamble. First of all, it's the first place we see this phrase, general welfare. So we see promote the general welfare in the preamble. We're going to talk more about that when we get to Article 1, Section 8. But if you go back and you look at the Articles of Confederation, it helps us to understand general welfare in the Constitution itself. And the first thing I'll show you right here before we get into Article 1, Section 8 is the Webster's Dictionary of General Welfare. 1828 is the closest Webster's to the time. And here's what it said. It's exemption from any unusual evil or calamity, the enjoyment of peace and prosperity, or the ordinary blessings of society and civil government. And then there's three really important words. What are they? Applied to the states. So general welfare is not individual welfare. It's not the right of Congress to take something from you to give to someone else for their individual welfare. General welfare was for the states. It was for the system itself, to keep freedom for all of the states and for the system in general, not for individual welfare. We'll come back to that one a little later. I just wanted to point it out in the preamble. And then the last thing in the preamble I'd point out is the blessings of liberty. For those that say it's a godless constitution, I'm just wondering where those blessings are supposed to flow from. I like blessings of liberty being in there. Okay, let's take a look at the Constitution at a glance. And in your study guide, you've got a one-pager there of the whole Constitution on one page. And I do that so that I can see it at a glance and quickly figure out, okay, where was that issue of grand jury? Where was that particular issue? And I can go find it very quickly. But let's take a look at the whole thing. First, we've got 7 articles. Okay, Article 1 is the legislative branch. So there's where we learn about Congress. Article 2 is the presidency. So that's our executive branch. We'll spend a little more time on that later. Article 3, the judicial branch. We're going to spend a lot of time on the judiciary. That's become a very, probably the most dangerous branch in terms of taking the Constitution and turning it into something it was never intended to be. Article 4 is about interstate relations. We're not going to come back to that much except to point out that there in Article 4, Section 4 is where we're guaranteed to be a republic, not a democracy. Article 5 is the amendment process. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. Article 6 is where you get the supremacy clause. They validated the debts from the Confederacy, no religious tests, sorts of things like that. And then Article 7 is ratification. We won't spend any time on that in our class. So that's the 7 articles. Now let's just run through real quick, get a big picture of the 27 amendments. So 27 times we've amended what these guys in this room initially did. So they put the Constitution in place, the states ratify, it becomes the law of the land. 27 times we've made changes, tweaks if you will, sometimes big changes to that original Constitution. And I'm going to give these to you not necessarily in numerical order, but I call it buckets. I put them in buckets of what they do. So it's not what number they are, but what part of the Constitution do they amend. Of course, the Bill of Rights, that's our first 10 amendments. We're going to come back to that later and spend more specific time on it, but that's our first bucket. Let's just set those aside for right now. We'll come back. The second bucket are the amendments that affect the presidency. So I mentioned earlier there's 5 amendments affecting the presidency. Now the 12th was simply correcting what really was potentially a real problem in the Electoral College in choosing the president. Think about it this way. Back in their day, if you had someone who got the most votes became president in the Electoral College, most votes, and their arch rival becomes vice president, so that's their second in command. Back in the day of duels and assassinations and all, not a good idea, I don't think. So that didn't work out so well. Fortunately, they didn't actually assassinate anybody. But when Adams was president and Jefferson, his arch rival, became vice president, I think everybody went, ding, 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 this is a problem. So 12th Amendment changes that. Now we get president and vice president coming from the same team, and you make sure your second in command is of the same philosophy that you are when you're running and going to back up what you're doing. So that's the 12th Amendment. 20th Amendment had to do with dates, and it essentially was trying to stop a lame duck Congress. Now back then, it was enough to stop a lame duck Congress. Today, of course, with our travel being so much easier, 2 months is plenty of time for these guys to wreak a lot of havoc and cause a lot of problems. If one party gets voted out in November, they've got 2 months where they can pass all kinds of stuff before the new Congress comes in January. So that might actually be a good place for us to have a new amendment that would tighten up those dates so you didn't have as much of an opportunity for a lame duck Congress. But 20th Amendment affects when the President and Congress come into power and are sworn in. 22nd Amendment. Easiest way to remember the 22nd Amendment for me, I just think two terms. All right? 22nd Amendment is when we limited the President to 2 terms. And think about why we did that. Remember what Rhett was saying earlier, how the only just powers of government come from the consent of the governed. So when we create a government, when we create a document and a way for that government to work, we the people are not giving power, we're loaning power to that government. And if we see something that needs to be tweaked or changed, the beauty of freedom is that we the people can take some of that power back. So we created a branch of government known as the executive, our president, and we didn't put a limit on how long someone could be president. Everybody followed Washington's example up until FDR. Then you get that 4th term, and everybody goes, yeah, this is kind of too long. In fact, we kind of started saying, you know, actually what's happening is this person is staying in, this branch is staying in power for so long, they're able to accumulate more and more power, and they're getting too powerful. We don't like the idea of a king mentality, of somebody being there as long as they ever want to be. And so we, the people, reined in that branch, if you will, and we limited the presidency to 2 terms. That was us. We did that with the 22nd Amendment. So we said, here's the Constitution. We love it. Great things in it. But there's one area that needs to be tweaked. We, the people, tweaked it. We took back some of that power and limited the president to 2 terms. Might be a good idea to consider that for the other branches. I'm just saying, all right? So that's the 22nd Amendment. All right. So then you get the 23rd Amendment, also affects the president. So we're still in our bucket of amendments affecting the president. 23rd Amendment was where we added the Electoral College for District of Columbia. So District of Columbia has, according to the Constitution, a very special place in our land. It was not intended to be a state. They did not want it to be within a state. So if you had the seat of the federal government in Texas, for instance, or in your home state, then you would either have favors for that particular state, or you could potentially have problems where there was too much conflict, and you didn't want that. So what the Founding Fathers did was they set aside D.C., no more than 10 square miles. They said that's going to be the seat of federal government, not a state, not within a state. Well, now that it's become such a populous area and there's so many people there, the American people said, you know, those people should have a voice in the presidency. They should have a voice in at least one branch of our 3 branches of government, so we're going to let them have electoral college votes. So we, the people, again, amended the Constitution. It wasn't something Congress did on their own. We, the people, said we want them to have electoral college votes. So now the people in the District of Columbia get to vote for president, and they get 3 electoral college votes. No problem. That's the 23rd Amendment. Now, statehood for D.C. is a totally different issue, because if you give D.C. statehood, now you've actually got a constitutional problem. If you give them statehood without amending the Constitution, then the Constitution says that D.C. will be governed by Congress, but now you make them a state, who's going to govern them? Congress, or does the state govern them? You got to now, if we, the people, amend the Constitution and make D.C. a state, hey, if I lose that battle, I lose. That's fine. I won't be for it because I like the idea of it being a special place that is not a state. But if I lose that battle, fine, if it's done constitutionally. The Congress is the one that decides whether or not to add a state. So they could do it. It wouldn't be a violation of the Constitution for them to give D.C. statehood, but it creates that problem in the Constitution. But D.C. statehood is a different issue. The 23rd Amendment simply dealt with giving D.C. residents the right to vote for president. And then the 25th Amendment is, of course, when the president is incapacitated. That's one of the ones we'll come back to. A lot of these amendments I'm going to fly through in our kind of 30,000 feet flyover. We're not going to come back to. You'll find that in our quick start guide for the Constitution, I tend to like to stay on the really non-controversial issues like abortion and guns and that sort of thing. So we'll stay away from the boring stuff, and we'll stick with I like the controversial stuff. So anyway, we'll come to some of the fun stuff, the controversial stuff, but the boring stuff about dates like the 20th Amendment, we're done with that. We're not going to come back. Here's one we're not going to come back to. It's another bucket of amendments. It's the bucket of judicial amendments, and there's only one. It's the 11th Amendment, and it dealt with a very specific kind of suit when a citizen outside of a state was suing that state. And so initially, they had given original jurisdiction to the federal courts. It happened very quickly after the Constitution was adopted. It was actually Georgia got sued by a non-citizen. And the states all said, whoa, we don't like this idea of the feds having original jurisdiction. So the 11th Amendment was adopted. Another boring issue. We're not going to come back to it. Okay, 3 amendments in our next bucket. This is the congressional amendments. So we have 3 amendments actually affecting Congress. 17th, 20th, we already talked about. It affected Congress and the president, so it's in both those buckets. So 17th and 27th. 17th is, in my humble opinion, the second worst amendment to the Constitution. And the reason I say that is because what it did was it changed the way we choose our senators. What these guys put in place, they said, you know, this is going to be a very special form of a republic. Our system of federalism is going to be different than what anybody else has had, because what we want is at the federal level, we want representation for the people, and that's our House of Representatives. Every 2 years they run. We want representation for the states, and that's our Senate. And those senators will be chosen by the states, by the state legislatures. And so you can imagine if the state legislature is choosing the U.S. senators, then the Senate is going to be the place that keeps the federal government from encroaching on the states, because those U.S. senators answer to the state legislators. As a former legislator, I can tell you, if the feds are considering a bill that's going to take away some of my turf, some of my power as a state legislator, or my state able to run something the way it wants to run it, and the feds are considering that, I'm going to be on the phone to that U.S. Senator, and if that U.S. Senator's elected by this handful of legislators, that U.S. Senator is going to respond. And that U.S. Senator is going to stop the feds from encroaching upon the states. 17th Amendment, 1913, changes that. And no longer are those senators chosen by the legislature, they're elected by the people at large, direct election of senators. What happened was, after that, you can look at the hockey stick growth of the federal government. Not just in terms of size, but in terms of jurisdiction. Because now you got the U.S. senators coming home and saying, oh, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bring your individual welfare from the federal level, and there's nobody to stop them. There's no longer that buffer of the state saying no through the U.S. Senate. So now the House and the Senate are essentially doing the same thing. So it's been a very bad thing in terms of jurisdictional government and moving so much of our stuff to Washington, D.C. It was slowly, in some ways I blame the folks in 1913 for adopting the amendment, but it was already slowly happening. Several of the states had already chosen through their state legislatures to no longer choose their U.S. senators through the legislature. They were putting it on the ballot, and then they were choosing, but they were just rubber stamping what happened in the ballot box. So it was sort of happening over time, but in 1913, that's when that amendment was adopted. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I mean, if you think about it, the other side's argument's a lot easier, right? If I'm on the other side, I can get up and say, I don't want the politicians at the state capitol choosing my U.S. senator. I want to choose my U.S. senator. That takes about 20 seconds to say. All that stuff I just explained to why it's better to have the U.S. senators, it took me, 5 minutes? So, I mean, we lose that battle. It's just not going to happen. So maybe if we can get 1 million people to go through this class, we'll finally be able to reverse that and get back to having our senators chosen by the legislatures. Okay, 27th Amendment is actually the last one to be in the Constitution. And now you're really going to say, this Rick Green's brain really works weird, because we're going to start at the back of the book. The very first thing we're actually going to read out of the Constitution is the 27th Amendment. So at the very end, the last amendment to the Constitution, we're going to start at the back of the book. So if everybody will open up their Constitution Made Easy and turn with me to page 62 and 63. 63 is the Constitution Made Easy version, and 62 is the original version. This amendment is quite interesting to me for a reason other than the language in the amendment itself. The amendment itself says, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall intervene. So pretty simple, right? I mean, all we're talking about is we're saying that if Congress votes themselves a pay raise, that's fine, but they can't take the money, they don't get the pay raise until they come home for re-election, and then in the next session of Congress, the pay raise can kick in. So if they did it today, if Congress passed an increase in their salary right now today, they have to come home, get elected in November, and then next January, that salary increase can kick in. Now, they've sort of figured out a workaround here because they passed the cost of living adjustment law years ago, and so that law automatically gives them an increase in salary every year without them having to come home and have a new law, which is what the amendment prevents, is that there would be another law that would vary their compensation, and they haven't had to stand for re-election because they stood for re-election after the time of the COLA. So anyway, they're getting their pay raise every year, in my opinion, violating the spirit of the Constitution, but they're not violating the letter of the Constitution. That's how they're getting away with it. But that's not why that amendment is interesting to me. The reason I jumped into the 27th first is because it's interesting to me because of what it says right above that. Originally proposed September 25th, 1789. Ratified May 7th, 1992. There's a few weeks in between those two dates, right? I mean, wait a minute. Proposed in 1789, not ratified till 1992? I think this story is so interesting because if you think about it, when the Bill of Rights was first adopted by Congress, there was actually 12 amendments, not 10. So the Bill of Rights becomes 10 amendments, but it started off as 12 amendments. But number 1 and number 2 didn't get ratified by enough states. So number 3 through 12 became 1 through 10, which means that our current Second Amendment was originally the Fourth Amendment, which means if 1 and 2 had passed, then all of my NRA patches would be no good because they all say Second Amendment. I'd have to redo them. So the First and Second Amendment didn't get ratified. So the original Second Amendment sits dormant for all these years. This fellow out of Austin, Texas, by the name of Greg Watson, in 1982, is writing his research paper in college on the Equal Rights Amendment. And his research, he finds this unratified amendment. And he says, well, wait, it was adopted by Congress. There's no limit on the time. And some states ratified. If we get enough other states to ratify it, it's got to go in the Constitution. So he changes his paper, writes his paper on this unratified amendment, says we could get this thing in the Constitution, turns it into his professor. His professor says, that's a crazy idea. Gives him a C, says it'll never happen, which of course just motivated Greg Watson. He says, yeah, I'll show you. He starts writing letters to legislators in all these other states. 10 years later, Greg Watson got enough states to ratify to where that amendment, originally the second, was in the Constitution and became the 27th Amendment. I say that for two reasons. Number one, and by the way, I know Greg he used to office in the office next to me at the state capitol in Austin. That's how I originally heard the story. Of course, I went and researched this to make sure he was telling me the truth. But I tell you that for two reasons. Number one person can make a difference. I think it's a great example. Everybody says it's impossible to get an amendment in the Constitution. One guy, man, he made a huge difference. And the second reason is just a little more evidence for you that all great things come from Texas. That's the reason I told you that story. So, okay, so that's the 27th Amendment. You got 3 amendments affecting Congress. So we've gone through several of our buckets. Now our next bucket are the Civil Rights Amendments and amendments that end slavery, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Well, we could spend all night just on these 3. 13th, end slavery. 14th Amendment was specifically put in because if you think about it, you had a lot of states in the South that even though slavery had ended, they were not protecting the rights of former slaves. They weren't letting them vote. I mean, you name it, whatever the issue was. They weren't given equal protection, if you will. So the 14th Amendment was designed to say, hey, we're going to make sure that the rights that one citizen has in a state are protected and guaranteed to every other citizen in the state. Now, here's the deal with the 14th, folks. We could spend, I don't know, a year on the 14th Amendment. It's a major area of jurisprudence. In legal communities, there's a split over what the 14th Amendment actually does. And this is the furthest in the weeds I'm going to go, so stay with me for just like the next 3 minutes. There's a debate over whether the 14th Amendment incorporates, or if you will, applies the Constitution to the states. And what that means is, if you think about it, the founders, these guys designed the Constitution and even the Bill of Rights itself not to affect the states, but to affect the federal government. So take the Second Amendment, for instance, your right to keep and bear arms. What these guys originally believed was that the Constitution would protect you, and the Second Amendment would protect you from the federal government, not allowing your Second Amendment rights to be affected, not allowing you to not be able to keep and bear arms. But it didn't protect you from your state, which is why in Texas we have our own Second Amendment in our state constitution. Whichever state you're from, I know from Arizona, in most states, Colorado has a Second Amendment in their constitution. I think it's 44 or the 50, I forget the exact number. So all of us had our own Second Amendment protecting us from our state and local government, while these guys had given us a Second Amendment protecting us from the feds. The 14th Amendment, depending on which side of this debate you're on, which side of this argument you're on, actually did take the Second Amendment and the Constitution itself and apply it to the states, so that if your state didn't have a Second Amendment, or if your state got rid of its Second Amendment, you could claim a constitutional right to keep and bear arms, and that the Constitution would protect you from your local city or from your state. Up until the 14th Amendment, that wasn't even possible. After the 14th Amendment, for years, everybody's debated over whether or not that really happened with the 14th. And what the court has done, I know said I wasn't going to get much into the courts, but what the court has done is, little by little, it has applied the Constitution to the states. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Things like grand jury, they still haven't. Some states don't have a guarantee to a grand jury, so, and the courts have not yet guaranteed that right in the Constitution. But the Second Amendment, you might remember just a few years ago, the McDonald case. And in the McDonald case, that was the question. Could a city government prevent you from keeping and bearing arms? Could a city government infringe upon your constitutional right to keep and bear arms? And so for the first time since the 14th Amendment had been ratified, 150 years ago, this issue went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, your Second Amendment right is protected even against cities and states. And so it incorporated or applied that part of the Constitution to the states. What happened for me was I was really on the fence on this thing, because I had been on the side that said, no, the 14th only had to do with this specific situation in the South where you had former slaves not being granted the same protections. And in the McDonald case, I read Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion. It's about 50 pages. It's long. But, I mean, he took me to school, let me tell you. I learned more in that concurring opinion about the 14th Amendment than anything I'd ever studied. And he did what we've been saying tonight we should always do. He went back to the original intent. Now, obviously, the 14th Amendment wasn't these guys, so it wasn't. I couldn't go to Gouverneur Morris or to George Washington or any of those guys to figure out what the 14th Amendment was intended to do. They were all dead and gone long before that. What Thomas did was he went in his concurring opinion. He went through all the debates in the House and the Senate, the debates back home, and he proved to me that the 14th was definitely intended to apply the Constitution to the states. And so I've actually moved over to this side, and I now agree that the 14th does guarantee us that due process, guarantee us those equal protections from our states and our cities as well. I'm so sorry for getting in the weeds on that, but if I had not done that, I'm going to get calls from all these people buying the DVDs and watching that and saying, why didn't you go into the 14th Amendment? So now the call will be, why didn't you go further into the 14th Amendment? But that's as far as we're going to go with the 14th Amendment. Just know that 14th Amendment jurisprudence is a whole subject in and of itself. And what we see today is that the 14th Amendment is used to protect us from our state and local governments or anybody else with regard to all those constitutional amendments. It does a lot more, but that's all we're going to cover in our quick start guide. Okay, 15th Amendment was specific to voting. Now, I know 14th should have already guaranteed that, but you still had all these white-only primaries, all these problems in the South that were keeping blacks from being able to vote. And so the 15th Amendment was to specifically say, you have a constitutional right to vote, and it cannot be infringed based on the color of your skin. So that was a very important amendment to get passed. And that actually opens us to our next bucket. There's 4 amendments that specifically are a bucket of amendments that deal with voting. So I'm going to ask my baby girl Cameron to come back up, and she's going to explain these 4 amendments on voting. Y'all welcome Cameron. She's going to come back. All yours, sweetie.
There are 4 amendments that protect our right to vote. The 15th Amendment guarantees that we can vote no matter what the color of our skin. The 26th Amendment says you must be at least 18 years old to vote. So that means I still got 6 more years to go. Amendment 24 protects the right to vote whether we're rich or poor. And last is my personal favorite. The 19th Amendment makes sure that we ladies have the same rights as the guys when choosing our leaders. Our right to vote is protected throughout the Constitution, so don't waste it. Every chance you get to vote, let your voice be heard and values counted.
Good job, baby. All right. Can't imagine why the 19th is her favorite one. We always call that women's suffrage. Let me let you in on a little secret. The men were not letting the women vote, and so the women were making the men suffer. I promise you. Okay, that's the real reason it's called suffrage. Anyway, so that fortunately we got it right. And actually, I find it interesting. Those amendments are a good example of how this American system of government has allowed for us to become a more perfect union. When we got something wrong, America tends to figure out a way to get it right. I mean, think about it. Even when it comes to the right of women to vote. Well, the men were the ones that had to vote on that amendment. So the majority ended up giving the minority the opportunity to participate. Same thing with ending slavery and civil rights. It's the majority that has, after often a long battle, comes around and says, you know what, let's get this thing right and make sure that everybody gets to enjoy these same freedoms. So I think that's a unique experience in America. You don't usually see that in other countries. If a majority has power, they continue to oppress and they don't share that power and those freedoms with the others. So there's your bucket of amendments that have to do with voting. Just a few more here. We've got everybody's favorite amendment to the Constitution, the 16th Amendment. No laughter, no amen, no yes, no yeehaw, nothing, right? Nobody likes the 16th Amendment, the income tax. Now look, 2 things on this. We're not going to spend any time debating whether or not it was properly ratified. I hear all these arguments and people say it wasn't ratified right and because the comma was in the wrong place. It's a red herring. You got to pick your battles. You got to fight the battles you can win. That's not one we're going to be able to win. I don't like income tax. I'll just be honest with you. I'm a fair tax guy. I think the only fair tax is when you're spending your money, you pay a sales tax. I don't like getting punished for making money, and I don't like getting punished for investing in my home. So as my property value increases, I get punished for that. I think those are bad taxes. Fair tax is a sales tax. But it is the law of the land. And as long as it's the law of the land, I got to obey the law while I fight to change the law. I'd love to amend the Constitution and get rid of the income tax. But trust me on this. Don't join these groups that say you don't have to pay your income tax. It's optional, all that kind of. Trust me on that. It is much easier to fight City Hall from outside the prison walls. so don't. And if you doubt me on that one, I'll get you Wesley Snipes' phone number. You can call Wesley and ask him how he enjoyed those days in jail for not paying his income tax. Pay your income tax, and then let's work to change it. And the 16th actually didn't give the federal government the right to tax income. What it did was it changed it from having to be apportioned evenly among the states. It made it easier is what happened. And it made it so easy. In fact, you might recall people saying, well, originally they were going to cap it at 1% or 2% or 3%. And they talked, it said, it'll never get that high. Well, now we know obviously it's a lot higher than that. I wish they had put some sort of cap on it. But it is what it is. You remember earlier when I said the 17th Amendment was the second worst amendment to the Constitution? Can anybody guess what I think the worst amendment to the Constitution? Yeah, 16th Amendment. So imagine this. It was done in 1913 as well. What were those people in 1913 smoking, man? I mean, they really messed up our Constitution. But it is what it is. Maybe over time we can get it changed and get rid of the income tax and go to sales tax. I think it would work a lot better, and I certainly think it would be much more fair. Last two, I used to just run right through these, run over them, and not even talk about them. 18th and 21st, to drink or not to drink. The 18th Amendment, of course, prohibition. 21st, repealing that. I used to fly through it, and then the guy that we're working on tonight, my caller, he gives me a stop. I was flying through it on a radio program with him. I was interviewing him on Wall Builders Live, and I flew through the 18th and 21st. And he says, Rick, wait, stop. You're missing a great lesson here. I said, what? They cancel each other out. And I just blew by it. And he said, no, look. He said, why did the 18th Amendment have to be adopted? We had a national epidemic. Everybody said, alcohol has become a real problem. The people said it's something we haven't been able to deal with in the states. We want the federal government involved to help us with this problem. Why didn't the feds just do it? Why did you need an amendment to the Constitution for the feds to go help with this problem? Because they didn't have the power to do it. Because we understood, and this is what Mike was trying to get me to see, we understood that the only time you could add a power to the federal government and let them do something new is if we, the people, amended the Constitution. And so the 18th and the 21st actually stand as glaring examples, wonderful precedent, that if we want the federal government to do something new that's not authorized, as we'll see in Article 1, Section 8, then we, the people, have to add it to their powers. And he said, we did that with the 18th Amendment. We said, you know what, we want you to help with this. And Congress knew as well. That's the other part of that story. Not only did we, the people, know that they're not supposed to do that without our permission, but Congress knew they couldn't do it, and so they adopted the amendment and sent it home to the states to be ratified. We ratified it. We said, we want you to do this. And then we said, this ain't working out so well. And so we went back with the 21st Amendment. And if you think about it, we talked about earlier how we loan power to the government. We can take it back at any time. We loaned the power to the federal government to ban alcohol. When we took that power back, we didn't take all of it back. We left them the power to regulate it. So the language still gives them the ability to regulate it. They just couldn't ban it anymore. But what a great reminder for us that the things that they do have to come from us first. We have to give them permission. But today what happens when the people say, or Congress just decides they want to do something new, they just pass a law and do it. They don't even look in Article 1, Section 8 and see if they actually have the power to do it. That's what we have to change. That's why we have to know what is it that they can do. What is the federal government supposed to do? What are those enumerated powers?
The Founding Fathers began with the basic idea that truth is real, it is obvious, and it does not change.
All right, Dave, we got a pretty broad picture there of the entire Constitution. Where do we go next?
Well, as you were going through the amendments there, I thought, I agreed with you on several things that you said, and I thought, yeah, everybody needs to know that the 16th Amendment is the worst amendment out there. But the 16th Amendment, while it changed the way that we do taxation, because the Founding Fathers established it in the Constitution for capitation taxation, which means every state is split up with every citizen. So everybody's paying equal here. But what we did with the 16th Amendment and trying to allow a 1 to 2% tax in addition on certain people, certain income levels, we had an unintended consequence there. And the 16th Amendment, what it did was it started forcing us to think of people in terms of the group they're in rather than individually. Because we always looked at people as individual. You know, Jesus back in the scriptures talks about how the sun shines on the righteous and the wicked, and it rains on the good and the bad. And God causes everybody to have the same shot at stuff in that sense. What we did with the 16th Amendment was say, whoa, what group are you in? Oh, we got to treat your group different from their group. And so we started with progressive taxes saying, well, you're in this group, so we're going to penalize you 55%. You're in this group, so you're 42%. You're in this group, so it's 38%.
Separating this too, right? I mean,
we started
separating
separating.
That class warfare.
And that's where we are. And that's where, when you were in the legislature, everything was group oriented.
Yeah.
You know, you got the representatives for the unions, the representatives for the farmers, and representatives for the women, the representatives for the seniors, and the representatives, you know, and so now and that's why we do hate crime laws as a result. Instead of saying every American is to be treated the same under the law.
Yeah, murder is murder, no matter what classification or group.
If it's murder of this person, that's more important than a murder of this person.
Yeah,
and see, that was part of the 16th Amendment, is the way the Founding Fathers had done it, we recognized there was a Creator, that He made us all equal, and therefore each of us get a certain set of inalienable rights. Now government comes in and says, well, we don't think you need that set of rights, we think they need that set of rights.
So it's not, see, I was thinking worst amendment ever just because it created this horrible tax system that we have, but it's even worse because it segregates us into these different groups and creates that warfare between.
Well, even in my case, I'm appointed in a number of states by state boards of education to do history and government standards. And so they got in this thing of saying, oh, we want to make sure all the groups are represented. And so in this one particular state, I said, no way. I said, if somebody did something significant in history, we're going to talk about them regardless of the group they're in.
Yeah.
If they did something, and so their thing was, if we can just do groups, we'll get all the minorities represented. So out of about 250 heroes that they had over the course of these 12 years, 9% of them were minority. And I said, we're not looking at what group they come from, we're looking at what they did. And so by doing that, we went to about 450 heroes, and it turned out about 25% of them were minority. We tripled the result by looking at what individuals did.
We focused on the actions they took, not on which classification they were given.
And so what happens is they're so group conscious now, but a lot of that came from the 16th Amendment that says we get to tax you according to
So
your
I already
group.
thut it was the worst amendment. Now you made it
Now
even
it's
worse.
really
Thanks a lot.
Well,
All right.
your second worst amendment was the 17th Amendment, because what that really did was it took a shot at undermining bicameralism and federalism. Because it used to be that the House would stand up for the people and the Senate would stand up for the states. And so the House might say, hey, we need a whole series of schools across the United States. And the Senate would say, no way. Schools, that's education, that's the 10th Amendment. We're defending the 10th, and you guys can work on this stuff, but we stand up for the 10th Amendment in the states. And when we changed the way we elected senators, then they became a super House of Representatives.
Yeah, they really did.
Now they're a representative, but they're elected by the whole state.
They're no longer protecting the state.
They're not protecting the state. And so now you got the feds, and the feds are only allowed 17 categories that they can operate in according to the Constitution and the amendments. 17. I think they're in about 477 now.
If you can even count them all.
And that's because, but see, this is not going to be fixed by the 17th Amendment, restating the 17th Amendment. All you got to do is start electing people to office who say, I understand the 10th Amendment, and I'm going to Congress to stand up for my state.
Yeah.
You don't have to have an amendment to make them do that. You literally can have them do that on their own by saying, I understand the Constitution.
Well, that comes back to an understanding of jurisdictions.
It does.
And understanding who should
jurisdictions.
be doing what, and certain different levels of government, which means coming back to those principles and why the founders set up these different checks and
we
balances.
also get into this thing, well, how can we do that out of our state? You're a voter. Elect people who stand for that. Because if you'll demand that, people will run for office on that proposition. And I love what was said here about this, quite frankly. This is what Jefferson said. He said, I believe the states can best govern our home concerns, and the general or the federal government our foreign ones. Notice that distinction. If it deals with outside of the country, that's the federal government. If it deals with inside the country, that's the states. And that's what the 17th Amendment was designed to guarantee.
So again, jurisdictional lines.
Jurisdictional.
Yeah.
He says, I wish therefore never to see all offices transferred to Washington, were further withdrawn from the eyes of the people, they may more secretly be bought and sold as at market. Now see, this is what happened with our cabinet level departments. When you look at cabinet level departments, the Founding Fathers only had 4 cabinet level departments. You had the Secretary of War, and you had the Secretary of the Treasury, you had the Secretary of State, and you had the Attorney General. That's 4 cabinets. That's all the Constitution allows you to deal with. Well, now we have 16 cabinet level departments, and we have 7 additional czars that we allow to sit in on the cabinet meetings. So we essentially have 23 cabinet. And they include things like education, which is a state issue.
Yeah.
They include things like energy, which is a state issue. They include all these things, and it's because we got away from the 17th Amendment.
Compare those two for me again. So the founders that gave us the Constitution and this system of government said we only need 4 to do the things that we're authorized to do, that we have that jurisdiction that Jefferson was talking about to do. Our guys today need how many?
Well, they've got 16 official cabinets, and they have an additional 7 officials, Office of Management and Budget, and all these other guys that sit in as cabinet
So more than
level.
5 times as much.
Absolutely.
And yet we've not given the federal government more authority. The people have.
No, Constitution.
We haven't expanded those jurisdictions to be 5 times as many
And you
jurisdictions.
know, we have law professors others who complain that the Bill of Rights is negative liberties. You bet it is. Tell the federal government to stay off my back.
Right.
I've got a whole lot more liberty.
Yeah.
See, the Constitution says what they can do. The Bill of Rights says what they can't do. And between those two, it's pretty clear lines of where the government can and can't go and what it can and can't get into. But we've ignored that. And as a result of ignoring that, now we have these 23 essentially cabinet level departments that are out there, micromanaging everything.
So
we
to
do.
roll that back then, you were saying voting, getting people in office that understand the things we're
That's
talking
right.
about. we have to first understand these things.
I love the way Washington said this, and this is Washington's quote. He says, "The power under the Constitution will always be in the people. It's entrusted for certain defined purposes and for certain limited period to representatives of their own choosing." And
Okay, wait, I got to back you up because I just started thinking about that. That's what you were saying earlier with the Declaration. Same thing is going back to that frame of the Constitution, the principles in the Declaration, that it first comes to us and then we loan to the government.
We loan people.
Okay, sorry.
We own all the power, and we give it how we want. He says it's entrusted for certain defined purposes and for certain limited periods to representatives of their own choosing, that's elections, and whenever it is exercised contrary to their interest, our interest, or not agreeable to our wishes, the people's interest, their servants can and undoubtedly will be recalled. Voting.
We need a lot more of that right there. People getting involved and saying, I don't like what's happening, I'm going to reverse. And I don't think he means recall election like we see too much of today. He means in the next election,
you're not going to be reelected.
You're going to kick them out and
That's
put
right.
somebody else in.
You'll be sent home. And see, James A. Garfield had a great way of saying this. Garfield was the 20th President of the United States. In 1876, on the centennial celebration of America, 100th anniversary of America, he gave a great statement about Congress. And people at that time were complaining that Congress was becoming too big or it's corrupt or whatever. And he brought it home again. This is what he said. He said, "Now, more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. Nobody gets there unless we put them there. And if they're there doing that, it's because we tolerate it." He says, "If it be intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature."
I like that word, demand.
Demand, and it is. It's demand. And see, that's what we're saying. If you'll demand that the people who run for Senate have to be a 10th Amendment person, you have to protect the states from the intrusion of federal government, then they will. They will step because they want to be elected.
You have to also recognize that quote you did earlier from Washington about duty.
Yeah.
In that case, it was to acknowledging God. In this case, it's the duty to do what we're supposed to do as citizens. Because if we're not holding them accountable, we've given over to that reckless and corrupt. Yeah.
If we got corrupt people in Washington, that's not their fault. We're the ones who put them there. And that's why he finishes, said, "The next centennial, which is where we are now, does not find us a great nation. It will be because those who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation do not aid in controlling political forces."
Not doing our duty.
We talked in a previous session how that only 1 out of 6 Americans are electing the president right now, and 1 out of 8 are electing governors and senators and stuff. If the rest of us, if the other 5 out of 6 or 7 out of 8 would do something, we could control this thing. But that goes back to us knowing what's right, what's wrong, how we should vote, what we should demand of these folks. And if we do that, it makes a difference.
And what to expect of them. So you know, if we want to be able to measure the people that are in office, we have to have a plumb line, if you will. We've got to know what those things are in the Constitution that they have the authority to do. So like Jefferson drawing those jurisdictional lines, if we want to know what the federal government's allowed to do, then we got to know what the Constitution gave them.
And you know, one other thing that you hit there that was really good was the 18th and 21st Amendment. And you'd always kind of glossed over them and just ran by them. And you know, says, hey, don't you see? We gave power, we took power back. And as you mentioned, the power will always be in the people. You know, Washington's quote, "This is a significant document. This is the only Constitution in the world that's older than the U.S. Constitution. This is the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts. It's the original Constitution. It was done in 1780. It was done by founding fathers like Sam Adams and John Hancock and John Adams and Robert Treat Paine, and a whole bunch of preachers also helped write this. And so this is what Massachusetts still has. Massachusetts doesn't use this today.
I was about to say they probably don't pay much
they
attention to it.
They still have this today. But right up front, listen to what our founding fathers, and again, this is the only Constitution older than the U.S. Constitution still in use today. Listen to what they said right up here under the Declaration of Rights. They're telling the people right up front. It says, "All power residing originally in the people and being derived from them, the several magistrates and officers of government vested with authority, whether legislative, executive, or judicial, are their substitutes and agents and are at all times accountable to them." Whoa, you mean in the Massachusetts Constitution, the judges are accountable to me, a citizen, and my governor, and everybody in office is accountable to the people. There are substitutes. Now, then how come the Massachusetts court does what it does? Because nobody studies the Massachusetts Constitution. This is the greatest Constitution in the world for keeping judges under control, and nobody knows it. But that is what the Constitution does. It starts with we the people, and we got control over everybody in government if we will exercise it. And if they won't exercise it right, we'll call them home. We'll not elect them next time. We'll send somebody in their place who will.
Yeah.
That's us.
So if we're going to do that, if we're going to hold them accountable, we've got to know what to expect of them,
That's
and
it.
we've got to know how to hold them accountable in a way that will preserve these principles and bring back.
And that's what
that
this
formula.
30,000-foot view helps us do. We get the battle plan. Now let's start looking at the specific tools and divisions, and is it the Air Force or is it the infantry? You know, what are we going to use of our tools? But now we've seen the battle plan.
So next we're going to dive into Article 1, Section 8, because it's going to tell us what is it that Congress should be doing? What are the things they're actually authorized to do? Where are those jurisdictional lines? Next time on Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green.